Hello everybody, and thank you for joining me, especially on such a momentous occasion. I'm gonna toot my horn, give myself a little credit today. I'm gonna ask all of you to give me a pat on the back for finally getting to this review. I read this book a month and a half ago. I was in the midst of moving, so yes, welcome to my new space. I had 5 books that I read and needed to record in the span of that month and a half. And I'm finally done! I'm so excited! The long road is not over. Not by a long shot. But I think we all need to say, good job, Beth. You are getting things done. Now that we've all clapped for me, today's book is Saint Anything by Sarah Dessen. This, I think, is the second time I read this book. And it's largely because I don't remember liking it. I did like it better this time. It was a lot different than the first time I remember reading it. But I will say, by the end, I got a little tired of it. I thought it became a bit monotonous. But the storyline wasn't as terrible as I initially remembered. I don't actually have this book. I thought I had a physical copy of this book, and apparently I don't. By that time, I guess I'd stopped buying physical copies. But if you've seen, maybe I'll, put a picture somewhere. There's a carousel on the cover. I could not tell you for the life of me why there had ever been a carousel on the cover. And then Saint Anything, I could not tell you why it was called Saint Anything. Now that I think of it, did I even finish this book? I vaguely remember this novel. So maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I never actually finished this novel. This is why I have no idea why there's a carousel on the cover or why it was called Saint Anything. I will say the carousel still played a very small part in the whole novel, and this whole idea of Saint Anything was also extremely minor. But what you gonna do? Let's jump into it. This novel has a protagonist named Sydney Stanford. Her older brother is Peyton, and Peyton has been getting into trouble off and on since he was in middle school. When this novel opens, he is being convicted and sent to prison for reckless driving, basically DUI, and then he critically injured a teenage boy because he hit him, and now this boy is paralyzed. Everything that Peyton is, Sydney is not, largely because Peyton is. And so by the time Sydney rolled around, her parents were like, we're not going to let you go the same direction as Peyton. One of my issues in this novel is something that I've pointed out before. Dessen can get very formulaic. This novel, it was more so formulaic in her characterizations. She loves a bad mother. Does she have mommy issues? Maybe, but she loves to have a bad parent, a parent who doesn't realize they're a bad parent, an overbearing parent, and that parent does tend to be the mother. I got very bothered by the fact that Sydney was being punished for Peyton's sins, and her parents, particularly her mother, because her dad let the mom do what she was gonna do. He didn't want to get in the middle of things, so he just would take a step back and support her in whatever her decisions were. Sydney would have all of these internal issues, all of these things that she wanted to say, all of these injustices she felt at the hands of her mother, but she never would say a single thing to her mother. Her mother didn't really seem to care when Sydney did say something, because Sydney was never right. It really bothers me because the mother is very one-dimensional. It's like she doesn't want to see Sydney, like she does not see Sydney for who Sydney is. She sees Sydney for who Peyton is, and she's not gonna give Sydney a chance to be her own person. And I feel like a lot of the things that Sydney encounters in this novel are her mother's doing because her mother doesn't listen to her. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As I said, Peyton is being sentenced to prison. Sydney and Peyton had been very close until middle school when he started acting out. At this point, they don't have much of a relationship at all. He doesn't talk to her very much. He's been in and out of juvenile detention and out of jail, doing things all the time that are getting him in trouble. And by this point, when he goes to prison, he doesn't want to have any contact with Sydney. He does not give her approval to visit him. He doesn't talk to her on the phone. And I both loved and hated this because it was a mystery. Like, you'd think that he hated her, but what did she do for him to hate her? It's a great thing for us to figure out. In the end, it's really that he didn't know what to say to her. He didn't want her involved in all of this stuff, but I wished Dessen had gone about it in a little more sympathetic of a way, rather than he's punishing her for something she may or may not have done. He has a best friend named Ames. He met Ames in juvenile detention. I forget what Ames went away for, but Ames is like a surrogate son for Sydney's mother, Julie, because, I don't know, Ames seems to be reformed. Ames is her link to Peyton, so whether Peyton is with them or not, like, she has Ames. He's a conduit. He can deliver information. He can give her little tidbits into her son. And this is another thing that really bothered me. Peyton never actually suffered for his wrongdoings. His parents enabled him. They would say, maybe if he had this hobby, let's build him a sound booth so he can learn to play the guitar and record himself. Then he gets in trouble and they don't finish this recording booth, but he still has it. When Sydney wants to use it for her friends, her mom's like, why would you even ask me that? Did Peyton ever use the sound booth? What is so offensive about Sydney wanting to use something that you financially invested into? And why don't we just ask Peyton? If her concern is that Peyton won't like it, well, how do you know if you don't actually ask him? She essentially would reward his bad behavior in hopes that it would change his ways, and then it never does. Yet, Sydney can't step a toe out of line without being grounded for life. So that's something that also annoyed me with her behavior particularly. I just don't understand where Dessen was coming from, and that's because this mother is not fleshed out. Ames, from the get-go, we understand that he's kind of creepy. Overall, he's not a problem. She's not going to bother herself with him. Where I'm just off the bat saying, I can see it. You're making a point of mentioning it, so why isn't this more concerning for you? Because we all see where this is going. Peyton is convicted. His parents are kind of delusional. They refuse to acknowledge the truth. Like, they just can't seem to accept the fact that he has done something so wrong and this is his punishment. Whereas Sydney feels the utmost amount of guilt about what he has done and what he has done to this guy named David Ibarra. She is obsessed with him. She can't stop thinking about him. She's always looking him up on the internet, trying to find information. She knows where he lives. Like, she's all this information on him. And she just can't stop feeling guilty on Peyton's behalf. We don't know how Peyton feels, but we definitely know that Sydney thinks she's partially to blame in some respects. Like, emotionally, you would think that she's the one who put him in a wheelchair for life. Because of all the money that her parents are putting forth for legal bills and things like that, she's understanding that even though they have money, they don't quite have the cash flow that used to. She decides to quit going to the private school Perkins Day and go to Jackson instead. She tells everybody she just needs a break. She needs to get away. But the real reason is she doesn't want to be a financial burden on her parents, which I'm like, good job being a martyr. I would really love your parents to understand you, to see what they're putting you through, rather than all of their attentions being focused on Peyton. Because this entire novel, her mother is obsessed with the fact that Peyton will not speak to Sydney, that he will not allow her to visit him. And she's like, I need to go to every single event and I need to celebrate every single milestone. Then she gets incensed when Peyton puts a stop to it. Why is she putting so much mental and emotional energy into Peyton when she has Sydney at home. I'm ready to see Sydney being loved and cared for. I'm ready for Dessen to write a book where the mother isn't overbearing and power driven and blind to what's right in front of her. I get it. The mom is supposed to be an antagonist of sorts, but I'm over it by this point, and I think it would actually be very refreshing to have a different sort of mother. Back to the beginning. Sydney's at Jackson. She has this tradition that she used to do at Perkins Day with her best friends, Jen and Meredith, who, can I say Meredith was like completely unnecessary. I don't know if she had a single sentence in the entire novel, and in general, I was disappointed with the road that Dessen took regarding these two old friends, because it got to a point where Sydney started tossing them aside in favor of her new friends, which that happens. But she makes such a big deal about how long she and Jen have been friends, about how close they are, how they're like sisters, and then how Meredith is part of this group too, and how they're all so close, only to have no storyline with Meredith. She has nothing to do with Jen. She actually will acknowledge, oh, I probably shouldn't ignore her call. Oh, I probably shouldn't lie to her about the fact that I can't get together. This girl is here for you. This girl's supposed to be a lifeline, a reprieve for you, and you're going to completely ignore her, and then we're just going to sprinkle her here and there. Thankfully, Jen does get revived, but Margaret, she was a waste of space. Like, it makes me so angry in the writing community when young writers, new writers, are berated for all the extraneous information and characters they include, but then a megalith like Dessen or Rowling or Stephen King, 10 pages describing woods. But he's allowed to do it. Anyways, she and Jen and all the Perkins Day kids would go to this certain pizza place after school. It was a cool thing to do. Everybody did it. So in this instance, she doesn't want to go home, largely because Ames is going to be there. So she spots a pizza place nearby called Seaside, and she goes, there's nobody here, cheap decor, what is that music on the jukebox? So she's going to leave. But then this dude walks in behind her, and she's like, oh, I can't make it look like I just walked in and walked out. So she grabs a menu, and she's perusing it, and she's like, okay, well, maybe I could sneak out. Only to notice that he is an employee there. So she's like, well, I guess there's no turning back. She orders pizza, and it's like the best pizza she's ever had in her life. I'm a little confused about this pizza place because it's like the best pizza you've ever had in your life. And they seem to do booming business regarding deliveries, but at the same time, it also feels like they're struggling. She orders her pizza, and it's delicious. As she's sitting there eating, she listens to the drama unfolding behind the scenes, because this girl has come in and she's an absolute mess, just crying. Seems that her boyfriend has just broken up with her. It is the same excuse that all of her boyfriends have given her, and she just can't understand why they can't commit. Why her relationships seem to be so great and then all of a sudden they're over. We get this little thing about how the dad's like, oh, I never liked him anyways, and Mac, the boy, who is the brother, so Layla and Mac, and then their dad owns Seaside. Mac's like, oh no, you did like him. I never quite understood what the dad's feelings regarding all these boys are. She does meet a boy later on. For some reason, she wants to keep that a secret. Whether or not her dad likes him is beyond the point. What is the dad's role here? What am I supposed to think of him? He just seems kind of throwaway, like he doesn't really have a stance. They have this little thing there. She just makes this habit, which I tell you, I cannot believe she does not get tired of pizza. I love pizza. But how can you eat pizza as much as she ends up eating pizza in this novel? Never once does she say, you know what, I think today I want to do something different. All of this to say, Layla becomes her new best friend and Mac becomes her crush. And they are part of the Chatham family. They do have an older sister named Rosie who had been a competitive ice skater. She had gotten hurt. She then got addicted to painkillers. And then there's their mother who has MS. We meet the Chathams. They're that family that you just want to be around, and their house is always so lively and so much fun. Layla brings Sydney into the fold, and this is where we meet Eric and Irving. Eric actually found Sydney at lunch one day because she would sit by herself against one of the exterior walls, and I guess his shtick, like he's a flirt, he just loves to hit on girls, is take his guitar and sing and play next to a girl. And Layla comes up and she's like, we're not doing this. But she apparently had dated Eric at some point. It ended, but it seems like there might still be something there, but he's always looking after other girls and she's always looking after other guys. This is when Layla says, hey, if you ever want, we sit over there. Eric, leave her alone. But Eric is in a band with Mac. This is a whole running thing as well where they cannot come up with a name. They may or may not be good. Apparently they're better when Eric is not actually playing. But then Irv is this big, hulking football player who always brings the best food because he's so big, he has to have all this food. It's a thing. What is Irv gonna bring? What are we gonna get to eat? He's also very level-headed, the one with sense and reason, who's always there to make sure they stay out of trouble and get them through. And I quite liked Irv. I would like to know what his point was. I don't feel like he necessarily added that much to the story. He was definitely a tertiary character, but I liked him. I just sometimes was like, what's his storyline? Like, what is he going through in this novel? Does he have some troubled life at home that you would never know because of his calm facade? Is he really aiming for something big with football? What's going on with him? Because you felt like there was something else there. They all become friends. Sydney continues to go to Seaside, and then at some point, Layla becomes infatuated with the idea of delivering the pizzas because only Mac has been delivering the pizzas, and Mac used to be a fat kid, and now he's incredibly healthy. He will not touch anything unhealthy, which is ironic since he works at a pizza place and he is surrounded by carbs and sugar all day. Her dad is not comfortable with the idea of her being a female on her own, delivering to who knows what kind of situations. So they agree that if Sydney comes along, then they can deliver during certain times of the day when it's safest. Wouldn't you know it, on their first day, Layla becomes disillusioned. She's not having it until their very last stop, and this cute guy answers the phone. So they spend way too much time there, and Sydney's like, let's get out of here. They get back to the pizza place, and this guy has ordered another pizza. He orders like 3 or 4 pizzas, and by the end, Mac and their dad are like, no, Layla, don't do it. And Sydney says, it's on my way home. It's in my neighborhood. I will just drop this pizza off. And of course, the guy's like, oh, where's your friend? He gives her his information to give to Layla, which does then incite a romance. And his name is Spence. Sydney, with all of her dealings with her brother, she can sniff out a problem child. And she is awfully suspicious of him. It seems like all of these things that keep him busy very much align with somebody who has had legal trouble and is on probation and is doing community service. The number of schools that he's bounced between in this certain amount of years, the fact that he's at a military school. She has red flags. Layla does not see these red flags. She doesn't actually bring them up to Layla, so it's not like Layla can even disregard her concerns, which again, that is a trait that many of Dessen's main characters share. They don't say a word. They keep their mouths shut. This is why maybe you should not read an author's entire series one after the other. You see all of the problems. Something that might be entertaining in this book stops being entertaining by book like 5. Layla and Spence start dating. They're keeping it secret and they're using Sydney as their beard. But then at some point, Layla comes to her and she's like, you know, we'd really like to be alone, which is code for Spence doesn't want her around anymore. And this is when I have a problem. Layla is portrayed as a very empathetic, protective, perceptive person. She's supposed to be this bridge between what Sydney is coming from and what she's going toward. And she's something of a safety net for her. She's a safe place. Someone that Sydney can depend on, rely on, someone that she can turn to when she needs somebody to talk to. And then all of a sudden, Layla is MIA. She is still using Sydney as her beard, and she's like, okay, so this is when I need to see him, and then this is when we'll be back. But then they're never back when they say they're going to be back, and so now this puts Sydney in a spot, and I'm just like, Sydney, are we not going to address the elephant in the room that Layla is using you? She's inconveniencing you. She's not being a good friend. She's lying to you. She's possibly going to get you in trouble. What this really does is it opens the door for a romance between Mac and Sydney, because Mac figured it out. He's not dumb. I really liked Mac. He may, of all the issues I have with this novel, he may be my top 2 or 3 love interest, because their relationship wasn't superficial. He was at times like, before we learn about the fat kid past, he does come across as that hot guy who just doesn't know it, like won't acknowledge it. But then you realize that he doesn't have the hot guy mentality because he's not used to being a hot guy. And so I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the love that he had for his family and the way he took care of people and the way he supported Sydney. Just the organic nature of their relationship. I thought it was really nice, and they felt like real people. He felt like a real person that she should get involved with, because we saw him develop. He was a 3-dimensional character versus the love interest. Of course, she can't acknowledge her feelings for him. They can't acknowledge or announce their relationship because she is afraid of Layla knowing, because Layla had made a comment at one point that says that she doesn't want her friends to date her brother. That was a little bit misconstrued. Her sentiment was really, I just don't want you to hurt my brother, not that I'm against my friends dating my brother. But that's a little bit ahead of our time. Traveling back in time, Ames is left in charge of Sydney when her parents go out of town to visit Peyton. She's getting increasingly more uncomfortable with him. He and his girlfriend Marla are supposed to be staying at the house for the weekend, and then he shows up solo. He says that Marla is sick with the flu, and she's like, is she? Like, are they even together? Because nobody has seen Marla or heard from Marla. Whatever the case, he shows up without Marla. She is like, I'm gonna go to the pizza place, and then when she comes back, he's planned a romantic night for them. He's cooking pasta, and he set it up in their formal dining room with candlelight and the fine china. He's picked out movies for them to watch, and she's just like, I don't think so. And she calls up Layla at Seaside, and she's like, can you spend the night tonight? So she goes down, and she's like, oh, well, actually, my friend is coming over, and she's bringing pizza. And he gets all upset, which I get it. She knew. He knew she knew. There was nothing about her having a friend coming over. There was nothing about her not knowing that he was cooking dinner, and therefore needing to provide it. So those were also things. Sydney's communication was terrible. I would have liked for her to be a little bit more deceptive, to come up with some more believable excuses as to why she chooses to do something or not to do something. Her interactions with Ames in particular because he's a real creep. I wished she would have stood up for herself a little bit more instead of keeping quiet. This is how girls get in trouble. She didn't tell her parents. She never voiced any kind of concern, even though they wouldn't have listened to her. I wish she would have at least tried. Layla shows up with the pizza, and then Ames steps up behind Sydney, and Layla automatically is like, there's something about this guy that I don't like. So she's like, hey, Matt, come over here, blah, 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 blah. Basically establishing that they're aware of who's in this house. This whole novel, every time something happens with Sydney that she shouldn't be doing, he's like, I'm going to use this as blackmail. I'm going to hold this over your head because what would your mother say? What would your mother do if she knew? You're not supposed to be doing this. But Sydney, that's what I'm saying. Like, she doesn't have any good excuses to reason away why Layla's there. She could have thought of something plausible to say, something, anything, other than, oh yeah, well, They have their sleepover. Layla chooses to sleep in front of the door because Sydney's mother has decided, in light of everything that Peyton has done, they need to remove all locks. So there's no way to actually protect themselves from this man in their house. We have an instance in which it's Jen's birthday. Layla is gonna go over there for the party. When she shows up, she meets Jen's new friend, Margaret. I keep mixing up Meredith and Margaret. She doesn't understand why Jen and Meredith are friends with her because she's something of a bad influence. She's not necessarily a very nice person. She's kind of pushy. She's like a queen bee type personality. She shows up and Jen has been drinking Margaret's lethal pina coladas, and then we hear about Jen's crush. Margaret is like, oh, well, let's invite him over, and this causes Jen to drink even more. Margaret and Sydney, there's tension between them because Sydney's trying to deter Jen from certain behaviors, and she's questioning Margaret as to, like, why are we doing this? They also order pizza, and wouldn't you know it, they order from Seaside. I find it really hard to believe that Sydney did not recognize the phone number that was being dialed, considering she's there all the time and she delivers for them. But surprise, you open up that door and there is Mac. Jen, she's getting into the heaves by this point. Mac is like, yeah, it might be best if you bring her inside because we don't want all these neighbors to see. The boys have shown up by this point, but Jen is in no fit state. Sydney gets her up to her room with the help of Mac, but then on their way down, wouldn't you know, they run into Margaret and Jen's crush. Sydney's like, what's going on here? And Margaret's like, well, what are you two doing? And she's like, checking on Jen, which is what you're doing, right? And Margaret's like, well, duh. I enjoyed the drama, but at the same time, what was the point? Margaret was never heard from again. What was the point of her? I thought she was going to be this undercurrent of tension between Sydney and Jen, perhaps even with Meredith, except Meredith is apparently too busy doing gymnastics and being a smart girl to have anything to do with any kind of ill-sorted behavior. No. But on another side of town, Layla invites Sydney to come spend the night at her house. What she doesn't realize is that her dad has gotten a band together, and it's like a bluegrass kind of deal, so they're all making music. Rosie is part of an ice skating company of sorts, and she has invited some of her old skating friends over as well, at which point she informs Layla that there's no room in her room to have these friends, so they're taking Layla's room. I'm all for bossy older sisters, but why is she just allowed to order Layla out of her own room when Layla also had a friend? As far as I can tell, Sydney was invited first, so why aren't we getting the parents involved in this? Call me an old person saying run to the parents, but why is Rosie just expecting things to be her way? It's an honest question. Like, we're not getting a lot of character development here. We're not getting a lot of sibling development, like family dynamics. This means that Layla and Sydney are supposed to sleep out on the couch. Mac is very gallant and says, I will sleep out there, you guys take my room. Turns out that one of the ice skating friends takes a shine to him. She is coming on so strong. He ends up in his own room with Layla and Sydney. He and Sydney have all these flirtatious moments, but before all of that, the others are there too. Instead of hanging out with the old folks listening to bluegrass music, they head out into the woods because on one of his runs, Mac had discovered this abandoned carousel. So they take their beer, and Eric, determined to prove he is not a lightweight, gets absolutely plastered. But while we're at this carousel, we never learn why it's there. We do have an encounter between Sydney and Mac in which she asks him about the medallion that he always wears. And he's like, oh, this is my medallion. It's the patron saint of children. I wear it to remind me of what I lost because when I was heavy, it would practically choke me. So now when I wear it, I remember who I used to be, and it's kind of a motivator. This is where the idea of Saint Anything comes from. He does gift her with a medallion. There's really no explanation behind this one, so this is Saint Anything. This is anything can happen. Every now and again, she will reach for her medal as a reminder of what Saint Anything can mean and what she can achieve and do. She's at school. Layla says, my mom has to go to the hospital, but Mac has the truck. He's doing deliveries. Nobody's there because both Mac and Dad are at work and they can't leave. Sydney offers to take her to the hospital. Does she think to notify her mother? Yeah. Does she actually think to act on it? No. I grew up in a relatively strict household. Not as strict as these two, but there wasn't a lot of give in certain areas with my parents. To avoid trouble, I'm gonna let them know. Especially because even if I'm supposed to be somewhere, they would be lenient if I was taking my friend to the hospital because her mother, who has a debilitating illness, had to go there in emergency. We get to her house sometime later, and the band that Mac and Eric are in, they want to enter a showcase. But in order to enter the showcase, they need to have a demo tape. A studio is very expensive. So she's like, well, what about my brother's studio? Let me ask my parents. So she asks her mom, and her mom's like, yeah, why not? At the same time, this is when she is going to introduce Mac to her family. Something happens with Peyton, which throws everything off. It all goes awry, especially because her mother then is like, oh, I never promised you that they could use this studio. Why would you even ask if somebody could use Peyton's studio? That's not yours to use. A little while later, the parents have gone to visit him in prison again. They have left Ames in charge, and she has said, you know what? Her mom didn't say no necessarily. She said no, and then she was like, well, maybe. So Sydney's like, all right, I'm just gonna let them. Like, what's the harm? Layla brings Spence, who is wasted. Ames shows up while the guys are doing their thing, and he's like, I don't think your parents would be approving of this. What would they do if I told them? Her parents show up unexpectedly because Peyton didn't want them to come after all. It just happens to be at the very moment when Layla offers Sydney Spence's bottle, and against her better judgment, she takes a sip. She doesn't even want to take a sip. I don't understand why she even takes this sip. It's against her nature, except that Dessen needed this for her novel. The mother freaks out. She bans Sydney from everything. Sydney's not allowed to hang out with her friends. She is allowed to go to school. She can do yoga. Now she's working at the tutoring center in which Jen works out, which is when we bring Jen back. And I really like Jen. As terrible as a friend as Layla, in my opinion, Layla was never that great of a friend. I always felt like she was really self-centered. And then she meets Spence and she's MIA. I enjoyed what we got from Jen. Jen is the one that I think maybe Layla should have been threatened by, maybe. Like, I wanted Jen more in the picture. I just thought she was a better character. Actually, I jumped the gun with Sydney taking Layla to the hospital. That happens after she has this rigid schedule that she's supposed to abide by. Because initially, she was to take all these SAT prep courses, and that's why she was at this tutoring center, because she would have to do it during lunch, so she couldn't see her friends during lunch. And then she would have to go and take even more supplementary courses after school. This is why she ends up working at the tutoring center. This is when she does not notify her mother as to taking Layla to the hospital, but she needs her computer charger. Who do you think is at the tutoring center when she shows up with the computer charger? That would be Ames. And yet we have one more reason in which he's like, She and Layla get into a fight because when the parents had come home and busted everybody, her relationship with Mac was revealed. So now Layla won't talk to her, but Spence has begun taking tutoring lessons. One day Layla shows up because he's been incommunicado. She and Sydney patch things up and they're okay. Not soon after, Spence breaks up with her, and I'm just like, we all saw the signs coming. Why do you have to be that girl? Like, that's why all these relationships are failing, because you're that girl. You can't see the forest through the trees. Ames gets evicted from where he lives. He and Marla have officially broken up. Sydney's parents like, sure, why don't you come live with us? And I'm just like, how has he snowed particularly her mother, who is so eagle-eyed in terms of Sydney? How has he snowed her so bad that she cannot see his inappropriate behavior or his deceptiveness? He moves in, and they do have some requirements. This is supposed to be temporary, because he's also lost his job. So this is supposed to be somewhere for him to stay while he's looking for a new job and a new place to stay. Doesn't seem to do either one of those. And so now her parents are like, nah, there's something going on with this kid. Sydney, she has no life. And so when she's home, all she's doing is she's in her room and she's studying. But because there's no locks on the doors, he can just waltz on in. He'll use any excuse. And we don't really know if he's just a creepy guy who is eventually going to do creepy guy stuff, or if he actually likes her and he's just really bad about showing it. I personally think it is the former. He'll just come into her room for any small excuse, and then he'll just make himself at home on her bed, and her mom shows up and she's like, what's going on here? It's almost like she blames Sydney for letting this guy walk into her room when you're the one that took the lock off the door and prevented her from protecting herself from whatever you wanted to term him because of whatever he might end up doing to her. She's seeing these things and she's like, I'm not entirely comfortable with this person being in my daughter's room. They confront him and they're like, look, you're not abiding by the agreement, so we're gonna need you to leave. He is none too happy. This is the same night of the showcase. Sydney has been unsuccessful in getting her parents to let her go, which again, it's so frustrating. And it reminds me so much of the mother from The Truth About Forever. What has she done that was so bad? I get it. What she did broke trust, all that kind of stuff. But in the grand scheme of things, what has she done in her life that has caused you to mistrust her so much? I understand you have PTSD from her brother, but what about all the ways that you condoned his behavior, that you rewarded his behavior? Have you ever rewarded her behavior when she actually had good behavior? They refuse to let her go because they don't think she's ready. They don't trust her friends. They don't trust her for having these kinds of friends. But they got into the showcase. They were able to use the demo reel and they got in. Now she is watching because they actually have video technology at this point. I think they lose connection, so she doesn't actually know how it turns out. What does happen is she gets a call. It's not, hey, these are the results, but it's, hey, my mom is in the hospital. She's had a heart attack. So she's like, oh my gosh, I've got to go, which, does she really? Does she go knock on her parents' door? Does she do anything to actively let her parents know there is an emergency and she is leaving? No. She writes a letter that she knows that when her mother discovers it, she's already going to be upset. She's creeping out of the house only for Ames to ambush her. And now he is on the point of doing her some harm. She is able to make enough noise that it alerts her parents because he's restricting her airflow. He's covering her mouth. He is making it very difficult for her to do anything, to scream, whatever. So her dad comes and saves the day. He like throws Ames across the room. What does she do? She gets out of Dodge. She heads straight to the garage, gets in her car, and goes to the hospital. That's your first course of action after this guy almost took advantage of you? I didn't get Sydney. I didn't like her. By this point, I was done with this novel. I thought that it took an inordinate amount of time. I could not believe this book was not done. Mrs. Chatham has survived. She's all right. Sydney spends the whole night there. She gets home and Ames is gone. The lawyer that they had been using for Peyton has gotten involved in the situation. Ames has his own lawyer who is threatening a lawsuit. Nothing's gonna come of that considering what he was trying to do to Sydney. She has had such a traumatic experience that she falls asleep. But when she does wake up, she has a conversation with her mom. We're on the road to healing with them. Layla and Eric start dating again. The band, which is finally named Brilliant or Catastrophic, they're gonna get some kind of recording contract of sorts. But the final act of this novel is that Sydney, who I said is obsessed with David Ibarra, works up the courage to go see him. He has ordered a pizza from Seaside. She is going to deliver it to him, and she's going to reveal who she is, apologize, and patch things up in a sense. And that is that novel. I was very glad when it was over. What has been your favorite book? Either my review or from your own personal read. Bye!